You are looking at a man rising in a crowded plaza. His question has been misread for 2,000 years. The crowd is pressed together in the dry morning heat outside Jerusalem, listening to a teacher. This man is not a follower. He is a lawyer. His posture is deliberate, the way someone looks when they already know what they are about to say. The question he asked was not about kindness. It was a legal boundary drawing exercise. He wanted to know who counts as a neighbor and who does not. He wanted the minimum. He wanted to know who he was permitted to ignore. And Jesus answered by making the ethnic enemy the correct answer to his own question. The Samaritan. The person that lawyer most wanted to leave outside the definition. That is the gap between the common reading and the original one. 7 of the most famous parables in the Gospels have that same gap. And in every case, knowing who was in the room when Jesus told it is the evidence that closes it. The word talent, as in she has a natural talent for music, has been in the English language since the 15th century. That meaning was created by a mistake. The parable it came from had nothing to do with gifts. The Rich Man and Lazarus describes the afterlife with specific images that millions of people cite as evidence for what comes after death. The chasm, the torment, Abraham's bosom, meaning a place of honor and rest beside Abraham at the end of time. Almost every one of those images appeared in a Jewish text written roughly 200 years before Jesus ever told that story. And the Prodigal Son, the most beloved parable in the Gospels, ends before the elder brother gives his answer. The father is still talking when the story stops. Jesus ended it there deliberately, leaving the conclusion for the specific group of people watching, who recognized exactly which character they were. By the end of this video, you will know the gap between the familiar reading of all 7 of these parables and what each one actually said. Without that context, you are reading a punchline aimed at someone who already left the room and thinking it was written for you. Here is what makes all 7 of these parables work the same way. Joachim Jeremias, a biblical scholar who spent his career studying the Gospels, argued in 1947 that parables must be read against their original audience setting. Strip that away, and you're reading a letter without knowing who it was addressed to. The words are the same. The meaning is not. That argument now shades how biblical scholars approach these stories. And in Luke chapter 15, before the first word of the prodigal son, the text stops to name who is listening. Pharisees and scribes, and it records their complaint. This man welcomes sinners and eats with them. That is not background detail. Think about what that means for a second. If you have ever watched someone tell a story that was technically about a friend, while everyone in the room knew it was aimed at the person being spoken to, you already understand the mechanism. The parable form works exactly that way. Now back to the Good Samaritan and what the lawyer did at the end of it. In Luke chapter 10, verse 29, the lawyer asks a limiting question. Who is my neighbor? The word neighbor in Hebrew scripture appears in Leviticus chapter 19, verse 18. First-century Jewish tradition debated whether it applied only to fellow Israelites. The lawyer was not confused. He was trying to draw a boundary. Jesus does not give him one. He tells a story. A man is beaten on the road from Jerusalem to Jericho and left for dead. A priest crosses to the other side. A Levite, meaning a member of the Israelite tribe responsible for religious service, does the same. Then a Samaritan stops. He bandages the wounds, takes the man to an inn, and pays for his care. Amy Jill Levine, a scholar who has written extensively on the original audience expectations for Jesus' parables, argues that the crowd would have expected the hero to be an ordinary Israelite layperson. Not clergy, not an outsider, someone like them. Historians note that Samaritan Jewish enmity in the first century was documented and active, with violent incidents recorded on roads through that very region. Jesus replaced the expected figure with the ethnic enemy. At the end of the story, Jesus turned to the lawyer. Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who was attacked? The lawyer answered, the one who showed mercy. He could not say the word. The correct answer was the Samaritan. He described the action instead. He gave the right answer while keeping a careful distance from the name. A parable is like a mirror held at an angle. It looks like it is showing you the person next to you. Then you shift slightly, and you realize you are looking at yourself. The lawyer shifted. He saw the answer. He still could not say the name. If you have ever answered a hard question with technical precision while avoiding its center, you know exactly the move he was making. Jesus answered that evasion by forcing him into the one position he had been trying to avoid from the beginning. The Good Samaritan was aimed at one man. The next parable on this list was aimed at an entire group watching from outside the story. And Jesus ended it before anyone in that group could escape the question it was asking. Why does the prodigal son have no final line for the elder brother? Jesus responded to that complaint with 3 parables in sequence, each one building on the last. A lost sheep found, a lost coin found, a lost son who comes home. The pattern is consistent enough that most people hear the 3rd parable as the warm conclusion of the same theme. Joyful reunion, forgiveness received, story complete. But the 3rd parable does not end at the reunion. After the younger son returns and the father throws a celebration, the scene shifts. The elder brother comes in from the field. He hears music and laughter. He finds out his brother has come back and that his father killed the fattened calf, and he will not go inside. His complaint is specific. He has served faithfully for years. He has never disobeyed. His father has never thrown him a party. His brother wasted the entire inheritance on reckless living, and now there is a feast. The father comes outside and pleads with him. And then, at verse 32 of Luke chapter 15, the parable stops. The father is still mid-speech. The elder brother has not responded. There is no final verse for him. No resolution. No answer for the son who stayed. Biblical scholars who work on this passage argue that this ending is not incomplete. It is the point. The Pharisees listening on the outside of the story were the elder brother. They were standing at the edge of the celebration, grumbling about who was being allowed inside, refusing to enter. Jesus stopped the story at the exact moment of decision and left the ending for them to supply. The mirror from the Good Samaritan reflects most clearly here. The elder brother is not the villain. He is not wrong about the facts. He stayed, he worked, he kept every obligation. He simply cannot enter the party. The parable ends with the door open and the father still extending his hand. The person watching has to decide what they would do. If you have ever done everything right and still felt cheated when someone who did not receive the same outcome, you know exactly where the elder brother is standing. That is not a character flaw. The parable was built to land there. The parable is still mid-scene. It has been mid-scene for 2,000 years. Both of those parables were aimed at hostile questioners. But 2 parables on this list look like straightforward stories about everyday subjects: money, farming. And one of them gave the English language a word that is now in every dictionary. That word was created by a mistake made 600 years ago. The word talent, as in she has a natural talent for music, has been in the English language since the 15th century. It feels permanent. It does not have the meaning it always had. That meaning was built from a mistake, and the mistake came from a parable about money. In Matthew chapter 25, a master prepares to travel. Before leaving, he gives money to 3 servants. One receives 5 talents. One receives 2. One receives 1. The Greek word used in the original text is talenton. In 1st century Greek, a talenton was a unit of weight for measuring silver. 1 talenton was roughly 75 pounds of silver, worth approximately 6,000 denarii. A denarius was a common laborer's daily wage, as Matthew chapter 20 verse 2 makes clear in the parable that comes directly before this one. 6,000 daily wages, 1 talent. The 5-talent servant received the equivalent of roughly 100 years of wages. Think about that for a second. The first servant was not trusted with gifts. He was handed a century's worth of wages and told to go to work with it. The servant who receives 1 talent does not invest it. He digs a hole and buries the money. When the master returns and asks why, the servant explains. He knew the master was a hard man. He was afraid, so he hid it to keep it safe. The scholarly debate on this parable is real. One well-established reading treats the servant as paralyzed by fear in a high-stakes economy, not lazy. That reading remains among the most widely discussed. The impulse to bury what you have been given, rather than risk losing it, is one of the most honest portraits in the Gospels. Most people have felt it in some area of life. Then came the medieval church. Preachers began teaching this parable regularly and telling congregations to use their talents. Over time, the word absorbed the lesson. By the 15th century, talent in English had acquired a second meaning: natural ability. The Oxford English Dictionary traces that figurative use directly to the preaching tradition. The word talent, meaning ability, was not a natural development in the language. It was built by centuries of preachers treating a parable about financial stewardship as a parable about personal gifts, and the original meaning has been buried under that reading ever since. A word millions of people use every day to describe their children's natural abilities came from a 600-year-old mistake. If you are finding that these stories are not what you grew up hearing, share this with someone who has read these parables for years, because this changes the whole picture. The mustard seed carries a different kind of surprise. In Matthew chapter 13, Jesus compares the kingdom of heaven to a mustard seed that grows into a plant large enough for birds to nest in. Small beginnings become significant things. But in first century Palestine, mustard was a field weed. Farmers pulled it out. They did not plant it intentionally. The scholarly debate on this parable is real. One well-established reading treats the comparison as deliberately disreputable, the kingdom compared to something invasive rather than noble. Another holds it as a straightforward growth story. Both have genuine scholarly support. But the possibility that Jesus chose mustard because it was the wrong kind of plant rather than the right one changes what the comparison is doing. The talents and the mustard seed both have surprises buried in their original context. But one parable on this list is regularly cited as a factual map of the afterlife. The chasm, the torment, Abraham's bosom. Those specific images appeared in a Jewish text written roughly 200 years before Jesus told that story. What was he borrowing from, and what was the parable actually arguing? In Luke chapter 16, Jesus tells the story of a rich man and a poor man named Lazarus. The rich man feasts in fine clothes every day. Lazarus lies at his gate covered in sores, hoping for scraps. Both men die. Lazarus is carried to a place of rest beside Abraham. The rich man goes to a place of torment. He looks across a great chasm and calls out for water. Abraham tells him the gap is fixed. No one crosses it. Most people treat this as a factual map of what the afterlife looks like. Two realms, a permanent chasm, the impossibility of passage after death. But the imagery was already in circulation before Jesus used it. A Jewish text called 1 Enoch, written roughly 200 years before Jesus, describes a place where the spirits of the dead are held in separated chambers, divided by a deep gulf. The righteous in one section, the condemned in another. Biblical scholarship holds that the structural parallel to this parable is close enough that Jesus' first-century audience would have recognized those images as shared folk cosmology. Not a new revelation about the structure of the afterlife. Think about what that means. The audience was not receiving a new map of what comes after death. They were watching a familiar set of images being used to make a specific argument. And the argument is in the final verse. In verse 31, Abraham tells the rich man that even if someone were to rise from the dead, those who refused to hear Moses and the prophets would not be convinced. That line is the point. The parable is aimed at Pharisees who claim to follow Moses while rejecting Jesus at every turn. One more detail carries weight. Lazarus is the only named character in any parable Jesus tells. His name in Greek comes from the Hebrew name Elazar, which means God has helped. A man named God has helped who received no help in this life, and whose story ends with the statement that even a resurrection would not convince some people. Think about the shape of that for a second. The only character Jesus ever named in a parable was a man invisible to everyone around him, and the story carrying his name ends without comfort. Some resistance to evidence has nothing to do with the evidence itself. It has to do with what accepting it would cost. The parable makes that observation and leaves it there. The next two parables on this list take a completely different approach. Both were built to produce a specific feeling in the listener before the listener knows they are being evaluated. What does it feel like to be tested without knowing the test has started? In Matthew chapter 20, a landowner goes to the marketplace at dawn and hires workers for his vineyard. He agrees to pay a standard day's wage. He returns at 9 in the morning and hires more workers, then at noon, then at 3 in the afternoon, then at 5 o'clock, 1 hour before the working day ends. He sends all of them into the vineyard. At the end of the day, he begins paying from the last hired back to the first. The 1-hour workers receive a full day's wage. The first-hour workers see this and do the math. They expect more. They receive exactly what was agreed at dawn, nothing more. They complain. They carried the burden of 12 hours. They worked through the heat of the day. They are paid the same as people who showed up for 1 hour. Be honest for a second. Most people reading that parable for the first time feel the complaint is reasonable. That response is not a moral failure. That is the parable functioning exactly as it was built to function. Historians note that in a first-century Galilean village, being made publicly equal to latecomers was not only a financial matter. It was a matter of social standing. The first-hour workers were being placed on the same level as people who barely showed up in front of everyone. Then the landowner addressed one of the workers directly with a question. "Is your eye evil because I am good?" That phrase is a Hebrew expression for envy. It appears in Proverbs chapter 28 verse 22, and in Deuteronomy chapter 15 verse 9. The landowner is not making a philosophical argument. He is naming what the worker is feeling. And he is asking whether that feeling is the one worth having. This parable is like being handed a puzzle, where the correct solution requires noticing something about yourself. You work through it. You follow the logic. You arrive at the landowner being right. And then you have to sit with the fact that you spent the first few minutes agreeing with the complainers. The puzzle was not about the workers in the vineyard. It was about the person solving it. That is the second mechanism in the parable form. A mirror shows you who you are. A puzzle tests who you are before you know the test is running. Both force the person holding the question to answer it themselves. The experience of watching someone receive the same outcome for less effort is one of the most common sources of resentment in any community. The parable does not resolve it. It asks what you want to do with it once you have it. The final parable on this list takes a different approach. In Matthew chapter 13, Jesus tells the parable of a sower scattering seed. Some falls on the path, and birds eat it. Some falls on rocky ground and withers. Some falls among thorns and is choked out. Some falls on good soil and produces a harvest. Most people hear this and immediately start assigning themselves a type. But Jesus interprets this parable himself in verses 18 through 23 of Matthew chapter 13. That is rare. Most parables are left without an attached explanation. The sower is one of the only ones that is not. And the explanation does not describe 4 fixed categories of people. It describes 4 conditions the message encounters. The same seed in different circumstances. The parable is about what happens to the word in different situations, not a permanent verdict on the listener's character. Most people have found that the same idea lands differently in different seasons of life. Every parable on this list ends with the question still in the air, pointed back at whoever is listening. If Jesus built that mechanism deliberately across all 7 of these stories, what does that say about the only form of teaching that could have worked? Every parable on this list ends the same way, not with a verdict, with a question. Joachim Jeremias gave a name to what all 7 of these parables are doing. He called the ending structure a direct challenge form, a device built to hold the question open until the person in the room supplies the verdict themselves. Not a story with a lesson at the end, a mirror angled to catch whoever is standing in front of it. The story refuses to close because it is not finished. The ending belongs to the audience. The Good Samaritan ends with Jesus asking the lawyer which of the 3 was the neighbor. The lawyer has to say the answer himself. The Prodigal Son ends with the father mid-speech, and the elder brother's response never recorded. The workers in the vineyard ends with the landowner's challenge still in the air. The sower's interpretation ends without telling the disciples which condition they are currently in. If you want to keep going with who these parables were aimed at, the Pharisees, what they believed, and why so many of Jesus' most pointed teachings were directed at them, that is covered in a separate video on this channel. And if you want to keep going, subscribe. There is a new Bible explainer here every day. Jesus built a form that refuses to close. Every one of these 7 parables is still mid-scene. The Good Samaritan ends with a question the lawyer had to answer himself. The Prodigal Son ends with a door still open and a father still pleading. The workers in the vineyard ends with the landowner still looking at the man who feels cheated. These 7 stories have been explained for 2,000 years as lessons for whoever is listening. But they were built as questions for the people in the room who are certain they did not need one. They are still waiting for an answer.